He's a regular appearance on TVO, especially Stephen Pakin's The Agenda. He's a charismatic and inspirational speaker, receiving a number of teaching awards. And his research focuses mainly on the psychology of self-deception, religion, mythology, and narrative, and the sources of social and individual aggression. So he talks for himself. He's well-renowned. So let's not wait anymore. Dr. Jordan Peterson.
So this is a little bit more complicated a title than the one that was in the information. But I wanted to talk to you guys today about a variety of issues that I think are relevant to conceptualizations of mental illness and mental health, and also relevant to issues of diagnosis. And so I'm going to walk you through a critique, I suppose, of those ideas and propose some alternatives. The title, as you no doubt can read, is Illness, Deception, Complexity, and Positive Feedback Loops. Makes a rather strange collection of ideas, but the idea of mental illness and even of illness is actually a relatively strange collection of ideas, so that doesn't really bother me too much. So let's talk first of all about problems that you might encounter when you're attempting to determine what a mental illness is. And the first problem is really a technical one, and it's a problem that actually affects you regardless of what you're doing, and it's the problem of categorization. And when you categorize things, you're basically trying to determine, in some sense, how they're the same and how they're different. Although the technical problem comes in that there are an almost infinite number of ways that you can define same, and equally there are almost an infinite number of ways that you can define different. And so when you state that categorization is a matter of identifying similarities and dissimilarities, that actually doesn't take you very far, because it doesn't get to the root of the problem. And part of the root of the problem always is categorization for what. People think that when you categorize things, you're basing your categories on the idea, on the idea of sorting by objective similarity. But actually, when people are active in the world doing things that matter, although they think they're doing that because they've basically been convinced to believe that they think naturally like scientists, they're hardly ever doing that. There are scientific categories, and technically speaking, most of the objects of scientific categories fall into the classical category. And a classical category is like the category of triangles. And the reason the category of triangles is a classical category is because you can precisely define it. There are precise and bounded inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so a triangle has to have 3 sides and 3 angles, and they have to sum up to 180 degrees. And if that doesn't happen, then it's not a triangle. And there's no ifs, buts, or maybes, and there's no gray areas. And most of the categories that scientists use when they're doing things that are truly scientific are classical categories, or at least the categories under development are being developed in a way so that they move towards the stature of classical categories. But unfortunately, when you're doing something like psychological work or psychiatric work, what you're doing is actually not science. It's more like engineering, and you could think about it as social engineering, I suppose, given that you're actually trying to accomplish something that has some desirable end. And so the categories that people use when they're trying to accomplish something desirable don't necessarily have to fit classical category structure. So one classic, non-classical category was identified by Wittgenstein as a prototype or familial resemblance category. And one of the things you'll note if you look at the DSM, for example, is that almost all the categories in the DSM are in fact family resemblance categories. And so the way you have a family resemblance category, I don't know, some of you at the back may not be able to see this picture very well, but we've got 4 brothers here. And as you may know, 3 brothers have little triangle-shaped hair, and 3 of them have blue eyes, and they all have very round faces, and one of them has brown eyes, and they're all members of the same family. And the reason they're members of the same family is because there are a list of attributes of that family. And if any member has perhaps 3 or more attributes, it's a member of the family. Now, imagine you had a list of 10 attributes, which you might if you looked at a diagnostic category. And then imagine your decision rule is that if you are characterized by any 5 of those 10, you have the disorder. What that means is that person A could have the first 5 category descriptors, and person B could have the second 5 category descriptors. So they don't share any features in common, and yet they're members of the same category. And that's a classic family resemblance category. All the DSM categories are like that. They give you a list of symptoms, and if you have enough of them, you have the, whatever it is, illness, disorder, however you want to describe it. Now, that works in psychiatry and psychology because once you start to think about it as a branch of engineering, because the purpose of diagnosis is not generally descriptive. The purpose of diagnosis is generally action predicated, right? You diagnose someone because you want to do something about the fact that they have the diagnosis. And part of the terrible problem that's encountered by researchers in clinical psychology and in psychiatry is that they insist upon assuming that the non-classical categories that characterize psychopathology are in fact classical. And so what that means is they'll gather a variety of subjects into a research pool and assume homogeneity because the diagnostic category is the same for all the members. But there's no homogeneity because the diagnostic category is a family resemblance category, and there are all sorts of subordinate elements associated with that category. It makes doing scientific research into the basis of psychopathology fundamentally, I would say fundamentally impossible, because there's no clear causal pathway to a heterogeneous disorder. And so there's deep philosophical confusion in the clinical and psychiatric literature, and it refuses to go away. Fundamentally, the reason it refuses to go away is because, especially since the late 1800s, psychologists and psychiatrists have attempted to delude themselves into the notion that they're in fact scientists, and they're, insofar as they're clinical practitioners, they aren't, no more than physicians are. And you can't do a proper science without having the proper categories, and the truth of the matter is, and it's plain and simple, is that our categorical structure for psychopathology from a scientific perspective it's a mess, probably approximately tantamount to the mess of astrological categories. So that doesn't mean, look, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. Like, I'm making a distinction here between something pragmatic and something scientific. A lot of what psychiatrists and psychologists do is maintain social order. That was a big part of criticism about psychiatric diagnosis in the 1960s. And, the people in the sort of radical left-wingers of the 60s thought that it was appalling that psychiatrists were involved in maintenance of social order. I don't happen to think it's appalling. I think it's necessary. But I think people should be honest about what they're doing. Because, well, we'll get to it. So here's another problem. Well, I alluded to this before. Why are you categorizing things? Well, one function is descriptive and the other function is action predicated. And this is interesting too, because people are motivated creatures, and they're not running around trying to describe the world. They're running around trying to live, and that's not the same thing. And what that means fundamentally is that our basic categories, perceptual, cognitive, or otherwise, aren't descriptive categories. They're tool-like categories. And what we do naturally, without even ever thinking about it, is divide the world into objects that are useful for us to use. And when you guys look at this room, you may think that what you see are objects, but you don't. You see things that are functionally useful to you. There's an infinite number of objects in this room. So if you were perceiving the objects, you'd just be here all day, staring at things like somebody on LSD. So, and I actually mean that technically, because people who are on LSD and hallucinogens like that lose their ability to screen out stimuli, and they get fascinated by absolutely everything. So when you look around the room, you see chairs and tables and platforms and microphones, and the reason you see those things is because they're useful. It's not because they're objects, it's because they're useful. And you do that naturally. And our psychiatric and psychological categories are very similar. We put people in categories because we want to do things with those people. And sometimes the people want those things done too. One of the advantages of psychiatric diagnosis that the radical left-wingers of the 60s overlooked is that it's often a tremendous relief to someone who, for example, is suffering from panic disorder to come in to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist not knowing what the hell's wrong with them, and the psychiatrist will say, oh, you have panic disorder, and here's the list of symptoms, and here's, a website with 100,000 other people who have it, and here's a treatment program, and, you're not the only person in the entire world that has this, and we kind of understand it. And the person, although categorized, breathes a great sigh of relief, because now that they know what they have, they also know what they don't have. And believe me, if you have an undiagnosed illness, not knowing what you have is generally a lot worse than knowing what you do have. So I'm not complaining about the fact that mental health professionals use functional categories in their approach to mental illness. It's perfectly reasonable, but you have to be clear about what you're doing.